So Professor Richard Brown, welcome to the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. How are you?
I'm excellent this morning. Thank you very much for having me. It's quite an honor to be here.
Yes, and it's Richard Hill here. It's just I look there. I'm saying my last name because we can see you at the moment, and you're not an old, aged, grey-haired fellow, but I am. But even still, this is wonderful to have you here. We were very fortunate to also get Joe Ledoux to come and have a chat with us, and we started inkling on this stuff, and then he prodded you and said, you should talk to these guys. It's okay. They're not too bad. And we're so pleased to have you here. We're so pleased.
We are. Now, Richard, you're coming from New York. How are things over there at the moment?
Well, they're a little bit frightening, but I was never, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I was never a big fan of Andrew Cuomo, but I really think he's stepped up in a big way during this crisis. And
right.
My family have been sheltering in place since early March. We're lucky enough to be able to do that and teaching online, but it's pretty scary out there, and people are worried about making rent and paying bills and having enough fresh food to eat and stuff like that. So it's next couple of weeks are going to be quite tough, I think. But yeah, people are soldiering on, and hopefully we'll make it back to the beaches someday.
Yeah. So in your world of academia, everyone's is doing everything online now, I'm assuming.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But the situation that's going on, and you're saying people are afraid of this, they're concerned about that, there are direct concerns. It actually segues to exactly what we want to talk about today, which is there are a number of places it's been published, and we'll give some references to that in our show notes. For me, it was a 2017 paper with you and Joe Ledoux. Then there have been a couple of others. You've written some just recently, which is sort of a review of things again. But it's this idea of what are emotions, what is the emotion, and I know you focused on what Joe is most well known for, which is fear, and that's just one of them. Although this is something you can generalize around all emotional states. So that's where we're going, and the idea that, as Joe Ledoux told us in early years, that your amygdala fires up, and that creates fear. And then you guys have gone, maybe not. So that actually the emotion is not necessarily that subcortical activity. Okay, there's a bit of without sort of painting a bit of the story, should I unleash you now on, is that enough of a framework for you to
absolutely.
Offer? Okay.
I mean, it was interesting because when Joe and I first started working on this, which was probably back in 2015, I think somewhere in that time when he was writing his book Anxious, which is a great book. And we were talking, we knew each other previously, basically as musicians only, but he's a guitar player, I'm a drummer, so we knew each other.
We're musicians as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how many of us academics are musicians. It's cool. So we just were talking, we noticed that, there were the two parallel conversations going on without much crosstalk. So on the one hand, there's the philosophy and neuroscience of consciousness, which is quickly becoming a subdiscipline of neuroscience. My hope is that it'll eventually somewhat resemble the way attention in the neurosciences is thought of as a serious subdiscipline that you could, do work on and be taken seriously. And at the same time, there's this discussion about the neurological basis of emotion. And the debates in the two camps are eerily similar, but there wasn't a lot of crosstalk. And by eerily similar, what I mean is that you have people arguing over whether you need cortical resources in order for the feeling, without going too technical, the subjective experience or the feeling or whatnot, to be present, or whether it's, lower level stuff like subcortical stuff. And you find that debate within the consciousness community, and you find that debate within the emotions community. And we were just kind of astounded that the words were a little bit different, but the debates were exactly the same. So that's what we started working on here. And of course, one of the things that Joe was more aware of at that time than I was this idea that psychopharmacology has sort of run into a dead end. People are sort of losing their faith that we'll find new effective drugs. And so we thought maybe this is part of the reason. Maybe they're looking at the wrong areas. Maybe they're targeting the areas that are responsible for behaviors without targeting the areas responsible for subjective experience. And so we think there's some evidence for that, and we presented a bunch of it. But that's a theoretical claim, but it tends to make sense of a lot of what we think is going on in the therapeutic worlds.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, this idea that that there can be subcortical, sort of brain-based sensorial input, bottom-up processing that produces a sense of emotional state, but that's not all there is to it. And I think this is the key. So I wonder if and I do my best to try and understand it clearly and write about it and explain it. So it's really good having you, so I could see how you go. How do you go at it? You know what you're talking about. But what you create is in the discussion is that the subcortical stuff going on in the amygdala, particularly as we're talking about fear in the amygdala, is a contributor. But there are two levels of the way in which our system gets a realization. One is a non-conscious sense of state, some kind of non-conscious state, but that is not a conscious. So that's not a self-reflective or that sort of that subjective state. And that subjective state is created with a second with a second sort of relationship. And you lovely in the short things, there's a whore and there's a horror. And I'm not quite sure exactly whether I'm pronouncing it right, but it's an HOR and an HOROR. Again, have I given you enough to now unleash your conversation?
Of course, yeah. I mean, philosophers don't need much to get us off on a tear, so that's more than enough. But I mean, the basic idea. So this is related to what in philosophy is called higher order theories of consciousness, as opposed to what are known as first order theories of consciousness. And the debate there is really over what kinds of representations or internal states are required for the felt part of consciousness. So on the first order camp, their idea is all you need to have are states that represent the environment in the right way, or that carry information about the environment. Whereas the higher order camp has always argued that you need an extra level of awareness of what's going on at the first level. So you not only need to have the information about the world, but you need to have some sort of information that you have that information in order to experience it. So that's the impetus for the horror part. Stands for higher order representation of a representation. It's related to the higher order thought theory, which is, I don't know if you guys really want to delve into all these acronyms or whatnot, but there are many varieties of the higher order theory. So what came up with that as a label for our distinctive approach. But the basic idea of all of these camps that are in this higher order area is that you have processes in the brain which control behavior, and those things are not necessarily conscious. And we take as evidence for this, for example, in the case of fear, there's a very famous case of the woman who had bilateral amygdala lesions, and yet for a long time people thought she didn't experience fear. She was heralded as the woman with no fear, and so forth and so on. And then they found out that in fact under certain conditions she could experience fear. I think I forget the details, but I think she had fear of suffocation or something like that. So it wasn't, there's a video of her where she says very, very revealingly, I think, she says, well, I didn't know anything was wrong with my fear response. For me, it felt like fear. What are you talking about? That didn't realize it was abnormal. And it's those kinds of clues which that led credibility to the idea that the subcortical areas aren't producing the subjective aspect of the emotions. And there's a lot of other stuff too, like you can activate that without having a fear response, as in subliminal cases, where you present like a threatening stimuli, like a face or something like that, without the person being aware that they saw it. And yet you can detect that the amygdala responds. And the behavioral profile also reflects that the amygdala responds. The heart rate increases, galvanic skin response increases, and yet the person says I didn't feel anything. So it's those sorts of things which lend credence to the idea that maybe there is this split level, and there's some other technical things which we could talk about as well. But that's the main idea, is that in the brain it looks like in the human brain and the animal brain in general, it looks like there are two systems, or at least it's plausible to suggest that there are two systems. One, which is dealing with behavioral responses, and the other, which is sort of interpreting those responses and contributing to the subjective aspects, the feeling of it.
Yeah, and this was an important part of it, is that so you have this first level response, which is a very sensorial, bottom up, subcortical, things are firing up, and again we're working. Let's keep it to fear. So you got the amygdala firing up, but it's a system. We talk a lot about complex systems, that you just cannot think of anything in the sense of linear. You always have to think of the complex system. So what happens in a human brain, from when I'm looking at the work in this higher order representation, we've got the first order, then we've got this higher order representation, is that those sensorial inputs interact and integrate and have a interaction, a complex framework with memory, with both semantic memory, but also autobiographical memory, but in a non-conscious frame that initially triggers behaviors and responses before we have a conscious awareness. Am I going with that
before.
one?
Yeah, it's not. I guess I wouldn't say it's always before. Sometimes it's roughly simultaneous, maybe even sometimes after, depending on the specifics. But the basic idea there is right, that you have these non-conscious. I mean, so in the background, there's an assumption, which is a pretty deep assumption, actually. So if it's not universally accepted, but the background assumption is that brains began on planet Earth non-consciously. If you go back and look at, amoebas and their path up, single cell organisms path towards more complex things like neurons, eventually into nervous systems. The idea is that, well, those things didn't need consciousness. They didn't need to feel anything in order to move around the environment and avoid being eaten. They're not simply automatons necessarily, which sometimes, a lot of times people they claim that they're not conscious with they're just being purely mechanical automatons, but they could have flexible adaptive behavior to the environment. And the idea is that you don't need consciousness for any of those things. Sometimes people really wonder about that, and there's a lot of debate about that point that I just made, but that's an assumption that's in the background of our work for sure. So that you have to then speculate, well, where does the consciousness part come? So if you can have if you could have a mouse, let's say, that can do all the things that mice can do, but without feeling anything, without being subjectively aware of its experience, and yet still have all the micely behaviors, then you have to, at some point, explain how the conscious part arises, the subjective aspect of it arises. And that's really what the higher order theory is aimed at doing, is trying to differentiate between the behaviors on the one hand, which are flexible, adaptive, good for survival, and on the other hand, the subjective aspect with the feeling part of it, which don't always line up nicely with the behaviors. And I think this is really a big problem, because a lot of times people see the behaviors and immediately assume, aha, well, those seem like they got to have some kind of feeling associated with them. And I think there are some really tough cases like hydroencephaly, where you have people with this unfortunate condition, and yet they can smile, recognize their mother's voice. And people jump to the conclusion, well, they must have felt something. They must have, they must be smiling because they're happy that their mother is there. And that's not necessarily false. I'm not saying it's false, but I'm saying it's an assumption that should be questioned, because without the cortical areas, it's not clear whether that's just kind of automatic response or non-conscious processing. So these are the sorts of the philosophical issues, of course, that come out of the paper, but the more pragmatic kinds of issues that come out of it is that, well, what we see is a lot of therapy aimed at changing behavior and neglecting the subjective aspect of the experience. And that's really, so whatever you think about these background philosophical issues, which are interesting to people like me, this is the really important point, is that a lot of times people go to therapy and their behaviors change, but they say, I don't feel any better. And we think that's because part of the problem is they're just targeting the wrong areas. And if you don't target the subjective aspect, the systems, as you guys are saying, are all interconnected. So if you're just messing with the amygdala, for example, You may change the behavior, but the stuff up here in the cortical areas is interacting with that, and it's going to bring those behaviors back eventually, unless you target the subjective aspects as well. So we think that's really the pragmatic point. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I could just clarify, if we're looking at the higher order representation of maybe a first order representation, it's that higher order interpretation of maybe lower cortical, things that are happening. If that's the target, then we can reinterpret some of the lower order representations. Am I sort of on the right track there?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so that if you reinterpret those lower order signals, then you change the way you experience them.
Right. So we could change the nature of fear, anxiety, whatever it might be.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's largely in some respects, some way, the success I think that things like cognitive behavioral therapy have had is they change the way you interpret what's going on. Of course, they focus on the environment. Like for me, I'm anxious about flying, so when I get on a plane, I need Xanax and a whiskey pretty quickly. But therapy-wise, it's like you got to focus on, well, what's that vibration over there? I'm getting very nervous about this vibration. Is the plane going to crash? But you have to reinterpret the way you think about that. So usually they're focused on the external environment. That vibration, or notice the person who's serving the drinks, they're not nervous, right? So you're being mindful about those sorts of things, but really what we think is that you should be mindful of your own responses to it. So it's like, okay, I'm interpreting this in the wrong way, and if you adjust the way you think about it, then you adjust the way you interpret the incoming signals, and it changes your experience on the plane. That's the general idea.
Because just using that one, we could almost in a sort of simplistic way clarify that there it is. You take a couple of Xanax and a whiskey, and that settles down those direct fears that come from being in a sort of a cylinder, in a tube in 5,000 feet in the air.
Yeah.
But you also have thoughts and ideas, so you can think yourself from information by the nature of the way you interpret information mentally. You're mentalizing of the problem. So right. You can think yourself into an emotion without having any subcortical activity, right. Or you can have both happening and they're both supporting each other, because this is the thing that we try and explain. Everything's got a feedback, this loop system, this dynamic engagement. Right. So having sort of established that you can rethink the way things are going. So you can think yourself into an emotion, but you can also think yourself, if not out of that emotion, but to reframe that emotion.
Right. Yeah. And that's the important point. Is so when you take the Xanax, if I didn't take the Xanax, I wouldn't stand in the security line and get on the plane. I'd be in the parking lot saying, I think I'll pass. So the psychopharmacology affects the behavior. So the Xanax makes me more likely to actually sit down, put on my seatbelt, and go through with those behaviors. But internally, I'm still very nervous. And taking the Xanax doesn't tone down that all by itself. I'm still very anxious. I'm there. And maybe I sort of notice the anxiousness and I'm a little bit detached from it somewhat in a sense, but I'm still feeling it. And so the idea that we have is that if you you got to address that as well. We don't want to leave the feeling part out of it. And this is not everybody does this, but we think this is a general trend in this area, is that people tend to leave the feeling out of it and they focus on changing the behavior. And that's unfortunate, because obviously if you don't change the feeling, then it brings the behaviors back. And that's the feedback loop thing that we were just talking about.
Right. So using imagination, in a higher order representational way, imagination, which is modifying it without you sort of going onto an airplane or being in an airplane. You're at home, you're safe, and you're using your imagination to reinterpret what some of those signals might be when you are actually at the airport. Right. That can go some way to changing some of those neural circuits that would be firing like crazy if you hadn't sort of done those mental exercises.
Yeah, because there are the two aspects there. So the one, there's the threat detection, which you're trying to modify. The amygdala is constantly scanning the environment, trying to match things out there to your profile of threatening things. So vibration, sounds, and those sorts of things. But then there's also the way. So the idea is, well, it's kind of tricky to put this in a non-technical way, and I'm not very good at it. But the idea is that. The idea is that when you have these higher order representations, they're not effortful. You're not sitting there, in like the way in which I was just consciously trying to figure out how to express myself. And I'm thinking, what's the best way to say this? So the idea is that it's not happening like that. It's something that's automatic. That goes on without your conscious awareness. That's what these higher order representations are. They're almost as automatic as the stuff the amygdala is doing. So you have to retrain those kind of automatic higher order representations as well. So training yourself to not be alarmed by the vibratory signals is part of it, but also training yourself to have the right kinds of higher order reactions, the way you interpret those signals coming in. That's part of what's important about the visualization and the imaginative activities, I think.
Yeah,
so you're retraining those automatic responses just at the higher level.
But so that's an important part, is that these higher order, the higher order representation of the non-conscious representation is almost instantaneous. It's automatic.
Right.
But it's directly related to your sense of your memories, your knowledge memories, and your autobiographical memories.
Right.
And so this is why therapies that go into reframing the nature of your autobiographical memory obviously are going to have some impact on the nature of this higher order representation of the representation, this conscious subjective feeling that comes out. So you can do it temporarily by doing that positive reframing before you go and do something, but gradually, I suppose, as you do each process, each time you go and it is okay, you actually can create a new set of memory frameworks that will remove your phobia.
Right. Well, for the people who aren't seeing this, I'm nodding vigorously to what you're saying, Richard. So yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it may not remove the phobia completely, and that's that's a difficult topic. But it certainly is going to change the way you experience it.
Yes, that's better. That's better terminology. Yeah. Yeah,
and that's of course the goal. That's what we want. I mean, so it's a bit unfortunate. I mean, I don't know. It's a bit unfortunate that the way a lot of the therapeutic community has developed has aimed, not everybody, I don't want to blanket everyone, but I think a significant portion of it is aimed at changing the behavior. They want you to go to the party. They want you back at work. They want you to be able to fly. And the feeling of the subject is almost secondary in some cases. It's like, that's unfortunate that you feel that way, but really we want to get you off the couch and out of your sweats, right? That's really the thing that we're trying to work on. And we think that's part of the problem, why there hasn't been a lot of success. You need to incorporate both. You can't do it just at the higher order level because the amygdala is going to drag you back down. You can't just do it at the amygdala level because the higher order level will drag you back up. And you need to target both of these and that's why, largely what you do is you give them drugs and you also talk to them and you hope for the best. And really, we think that's symptomatic of what the problem is that you need to have this explicit in mind that there are these two levels in there, and you may need different tools for each of those levels. And that's not clearly, I think, recognized yet.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes the higher order representation is, like, I'm thinking about Bruce Ecke and his work with memory reconsolidation, that they are, we don't have a conscious awareness of them, and yet they are a higher order representation. And then when we do become conscious of them and we recognize them for what they are, then they're liable for change.
Right. Yeah.
And this is right, because of course what Bruce is suggesting or bringing forward with the memory consolidation, which again is we see in Joe's work, is what that we are changing the nature of the way in which memory presents itself. So the associations and relationships. So it's exactly that whereas doing these, some of the CBT, I think CBT doesn't quite know what it's doing, but in the just the extinguishing process, that what you do is okay, you get a better memory or a better process, but you still got the old one which can be triggered inappropriate and with the suitable sort of traumatic stimulus. Whereas with memory reconsolidation, there actually is a it's literally a rewiring, but the nature of the way in which the memory presents itself creates a different subjective experience.
Right.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it when a professor says right. I feel much better.
Right then. Yes. Full marks.
Thumbs up. I'm good. It's like being back at uni though. It's terrible.
Sorry.
Richard, can I ask? So, where is this research going? Where are your thoughts going? Where are you wanting to take all of this?
Yeah, thank you. Our primary idea was to get some crosstalk between these communities and to have these kinds of discussions. So this is, in fact, the fact that we're talking about this sort of stuff is where we wanted the research to go. So that's right. Fantastic, and I thank you guys for your enthusiasm and having us on here and stuff like that. But so generally, what we want is more recognition of the subjective aspect, that it's feeling okay is supposed to be the goal. And changing behavior is also important, but feeling okay is important. And we want to just kind of highlight that. So our work has generally trying to get neuroscientists, therapists, psychotherapists, and those sorts of persons to take seriously again the idea that consciousness is real. I mean, everyone, I guess I should be careful. Not everyone agrees, but most people agree consciousness is real. I'm thinking of some philosophers who deny that consciousness exists, but that's neither here nor there. But to take it seriously as a neurological phenomenon, as a psychological phenomenon that can be studied and understood, and that is useful in these other endeavors, that in therapy, in psychology. And for a long time, the history, consciousness has always been hanging around in the background, but we invent words to try to pretend we're not talking about it. So implicit, explicit. That's just marking the conscious, unconscious distinction without having to say conscious and unconscious. So what we want is some recognition that this is a legitimate scientifically important concept. Yeah. And that's, you mentioned the review paper earlier that came out in Trends in Cognitive Science called Understanding the Higher Theory. That was the whole point that we were trying to make there, is like, this is an important approach that has important practical translational implications. And so we just want people not necessarily just taking it on board as true, but thinking about it, debating it, seeing if it's useful, comparing it to the other approaches that people think are useful. That's really what we're hoping is going to come out of this sort of research.
Okay.
And you've done that actually in the paper last year. You've actually done one which talks about all the other approaches. And argues your case in relation, but to me, I just read it. I said, this is just an invitation for everybody who follows each of those approaches to come in, and if people like to argue, but see, I'm a great believer in I don't like critical argument. I like creative, constructive arguments.
Yes.
Where do we go? Where does this take us? It's and I think this is. I really love this idea, so I'm kind of in it a bit, sort of boots and all. But I think what you're suggesting, which I think is very true, is always maintain. What's that wonderful thing Florey says, that a theory sits on the edge of the fingertips to be blown away by the merest fact. And so just keep follow things, reside with things, but always be open to the fact that we could be wrong.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's very important. And just let me add briefly to that, these ideas are somewhat controversial in some circles, because people really just take this, the behavior is there, so it's got to be conscious idea very seriously. And I take that seriously too, but also we want to look at these translational approaches. We want to see what benefits it has. And that was one of the points we want to make in that paper, was evaluate the theories not only on your kind of intuitions and what you think agrees, but how useful they are for doing the things that we want to do. outside of the lab in more practical situations.
Exactly.
And there we think this has an important thing to offer.
Absolutely. So from a, psychotherapy perspective, this gives a lot of latitude for effective change, which I think is very important. So glad you guys are sort of working on the theoretical aspect of this. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
So out there reading, there's a 217 paper, there's a 219 paper, there's a couple of others in between. There's Joe's book on anxious, and then his other one, the 4 billion years of the development of consciousness. Nothing complex for him, but all these things were discussed in this last half hour. All some of the important elements of those, and there's a wealth of stuff that the both of you have brought to our attention that I think give us the ability to be more confident. Because I just, one of the thoughts, just one more thing I wanted to just add in about the behaviors is one is that we just change the behavior, and that's there you go. But it's also this thing of, how does a therapist know that something is better? It's the behavior that tells us. In my last book, I wrote it appears that it's quite a brave thing to write. Now I talk to you, but I just said, a client comes in and says, I'm not okay. Then you do stuff. Then they say, I'm okay now. That's it. And they go home. And it's a fascinating thing that we have this this subjective awareness of whether I'm okay or not okay. So there's something about us within that frames that, and we need to trust that more, or at least listen to it more.
Right. Yeah.
And this is what I got from your papers, that this is how it speaks. Listen. I enjoy that.
Okay. I couldn't agree more.
Before we wrap it up, is there anything you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think we covered a lot of stuff. I mean, this is we could delve into any of these topics a lot more, but I just want to say that these kinds of discussions are really important. You know, as a kid, I went through some therapy myself, and it didn't really appreciate the way it was done. And I don't think it was very helpful for myself at that time. And so part of the impetus for doing this is that we want to help people. That's really what's behind the ideas here. And theories are important. And data is important, and you don't want to neglect one for the other. So sometimes you hear neuroscientists saying things like, oh, I don't have a theory, I only look at the data. And I think that's just kind of disingenuous at best, and harmful at worst. And what we want is the interaction between theories and data. And we want to go open-mindedly into evaluating these things to determine whether there's something in there that's useful in the tool bag. That we want to keep, even if you don't think the higher order theory is the truth about human consciousness, there are still ideas in there that are useful and that can be applied. And so it's not really at this point as important whether you say that's the correct theory of consciousness, but rather look at it and say, is there anything there that's useful for helping people? I think that's the important thing.
Okay.
Wow, I'm
Brilliant.
glad you asked the question, Matt, because that was fantastic. That's a great thing to leave everybody with. There's more, folks. There
is. Professor Richard Brown, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been a pleasure on my end as well. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. See you later.